Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 12 and 13. For this week we're going to be looking at aggregate expenditures. And aggregate expenditures is a concept that's looking at total spending in an economy. So when we look at the aggregate expenditure model, we're focused on a macroeconomic model that's looking at the relationship between total spending and real GDP. So when you look at total spending, you know that we're focused on how much spending by the four components of our economy and how it influences the level of GDP. We're looking at aggregate expenditures, which is looking at consumption, investment, government, and net exports. So now we want to look at we want to evaluate the equilibrium when we look at GDP. So now we have aggregate expenditures, which is how much money we spend, and GDP is looking at production levels. So you'll notice these examples we have here. If our production, which means if our expenditures equals our GDP, so if our expenditures equal GDP, which means if we're spending what we produce, inventory levels will remain unchanged and our economy will stay in equilibrium. However, if aggregate expenditures is less than GDP, so we're producing more than we're spending, you'll notice that we're going to have a rise in inventories. And this rise in inventories will cause GDP and employment to decrease because we have too much inventory at our factory. If we have aggregate expenditures is greater than GDP, so people are spending more than GDP, you'll notice that inventories will fall and GDP and employment will also increase. So we have all this inventory in the back, which will decrease, which will create a lot of challenges for us. Now, the effect of unplanned changes in inventories, like firms like Apple, don't want to keep too much inventory on hand. Not only is it too expensive, but technology quickly becomes outdated. So, Apple forecasts its sales each month and plans to have enough inventory to cover sales. If sales are much stronger than expected, they probably go through the extra sales through falling inventories. Now, the falling inventory signals to Apple that it should probably hire more workers in order to increase production. So that was looking at aggregate expenditures. Now let's look at aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply is looking at total demand and total supply in our economy. In Chapter 3, we looked at individual demand markets and supply, but now we're going to look at total demand. When we look at aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we're going to be looking at this model to find where the economy is in equilibrium. The aggregate demand curve is going to be the same thing as the demand curve, but it's the total demand of all goods and services. It's looking at output, and it's looking at the price level. And you notice it's this downward sloping curve between output and prices, which is basically the same thing as supply and demand. Now, aggregate demand is made up of a couple factors. And let me show you these. Let me go to aggregate supply first. Aggregate supply, there's two types of aggregate supply. There's the long-run aggregate supply, which is the potential of our economy. And the long-run aggregate supply is very important to evaluate because it's our potential and it doesn't change. Okay? There are factors that will change it, but we're not going to really focus on those right now. Now we're going to look at the short-run aggregate supply, adjustments that are made with short-run aggregate supply. So if you look at this, here's an example of the short-run aggregate supply. Short-run aggregate supply curve is just like the supply curve, but it's looking at our adjustment process. And let's look at where we're all in equilibrium right there. This is what we're focused on. When we're all in equilibrium, when all three equal. So what happens is we have these short-run adjustments with the SRAS curve and aggregate demand curve. Now if I give you an example here, now, let's say the economy goes into a recession. You notice right now at point B, we're below our potential as aggregate demand decreased. Now, we can do two things to get the economy back to its potential. Stimulate aggregate demand, or short-run aggregate supply curve will increase because of the lower prices. These are some of the adjustment mechanisms that we're going to focus on in the next couple weeks with fiscal and monetary policy, as I look forward to your analysis this week.